The story of the Vietnam War begins quietly, in a land of winding rivers, dense forests, and small villages that had stood for centuries. The morning mist would roll over rice paddies, and the soft rustle of leaves in the forests created a calm that belied the tensions slowly rising across the country. By the mid-20th century, Vietnam was a land divided in influence. After years of colonial rule, the French had held control, shaping towns and cities, yet leaving many traditions intact in the countryside. But as the world emerged from a global conflict, new powers and new ideas began to reach the villages and cities, stirring change. People across Vietnam longed for independence, for stability, and for peace. Quiet movements began to grow in both the northern and southern regions, each quietly preparing for the uncertainty ahead. It was a time of whispered meetings, cautious planning, and the faint tension that hangs in the air when change is coming. Then, after years of struggle and shifting influence, the country formally divided. The northern region began moving under new political ideas, while the south aligned with foreign powers, seeking to maintain stability and influence. This invisible line, drawn across the land, would soon shape the lives of millions. Villages found themselves uncertain. Families lived under a quiet unease. Every day carried both routine and the subtle awareness that the world around them was changing. By the early 1960s, small conflicts began to rise. Groups in the south, determined to resist the government, moved quietly through forests and villages. They blended with the people, the environment, and the rhythm of daily life. Their efforts were slow, deliberate, almost invisible to the casual observer. The world beyond Vietnam began to watch. International powers considered the implications of this quiet, but growing conflict. Advisors arrived from distant countries, slowly at first, and then in increasing numbers. Their presence was noticeable, but still far from overwhelming. For the people on the ground, life continued alongside the growing tension. Children played near rivers, and farmers worked in paddies, moving carefully through the green fields. Families gathered in the evenings, sharing meals by lantern light, while the distant hum of vehicles or aircraft reminded them that the world beyond their villages was slowly coming closer. The early days of the war were not marked by massive battles, but by patience, endurance, and the constant push and pull of strategy. Soldiers moved quietly through forests and along muddy trails, cautious and deliberate, navigating a landscape that had remained unchanged for generations, yet now carried the weight of uncertainty. The jungles, mountains, and rivers became silent witnesses to the growing tension. Even the wind seemed to carry stories of families, of villages, of young men far from home, and of the slow unfolding of a conflict that would change a nation. At night, the land seemed peaceful once more. Rivers reflected the soft moonlight, and lanterns flickered in small homes. The forests whispered gently in the wind. Yet beneath this calm, the seeds of the conflict had been sown. The quiet preparation, the slow movements, and the unseen strategies marked the beginning of a war that would stretch across decades. And so, the stage was set for a conflict that would touch every part of the country. For stories of courage, struggle, endurance, and resilience. For a Vietnam that would soon become known to the world. As you watch the footage of helicopters, soldiers moving through dense forests, and distant villages, let your mind move slowly. Let each frame settle gently, like the turning of pages in a quiet book. Absorb the atmosphere, the mood, the calm before the storm. And know that the story is just beginning, softly, steadily, and patiently. As the early days of the conflict unfolded, the land of Vietnam began to feel the quiet presence of a larger struggle. Small villages, once isolated, now witnessed the slow arrival of soldiers and supplies. Paths that had once been used only by farmers and traders became routes for movement and strategy. The forests, dense and deep, seemed to absorb the tension. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow under the tall trees, carried a sense of anticipation. The rivers, calm and reflective, mirrored the skies above, while distant sounds of engines and helicopters hinted at the changes to come. The local people continued with their routines, quietly observing. Farmers tended their paddies, children played along riverbanks, and families shared meals in the warm glow of lanterns. Yet, a subtle awareness grew that their peaceful days were beginning to intertwine with a conflict that stretched far beyond their homes. Soldiers moved cautiously through the terrain. They were often young, far from family, and carrying with them the weight of orders and expectations. The jungles became a maze of shadows and quiet movements, where patience and careful observation were just as important as strength or skill. At the same time, advisors and support staff from distant countries began to arrive. Their presence was deliberate, often understated, and yet it slowly reshaped the landscape. Supply lines were built, camps were established, and small bases began to dot the countryside. The war was still quiet on the surface, but beneath it, the foundation of a much larger conflict was being laid. The people of Vietnam observed these changes with a mixture of curiosity, concern, and adaptation. Life went on. Markets continued, children laughed, and villages celebrated festivals. But the rhythm of everyday life now carried an undercurrent of tension, a recognition that nothing would remain entirely the same. As the months passed, skirmishes began to emerge. They were often brief, localized, and difficult to notice for anyone not directly involved. Yet these small confrontations slowly taught the people, and the soldiers, the nature of the struggle ahead. Every movement, every patrol, and every cautious advance contributed to a growing pattern, like threads weaving into a larger tapestry. The land itself played a role in shaping the conflict. Mountains rose sharply in the distance, dense forests made travel slow, and rivers crisscrossed the countryside, providing both obstacles and pathways. This environment demanded patience, resilience, and adaptability from anyone moving through it. It was as if the very earth was a silent participant in the unfolding story. As the presence of soldiers grew, so did the experiences of the people living near them. They saw tents and temporary camps, the slow construction of outposts, and the distant hum of aircraft in the skies above. Each day carried new sights, sounds, and stories. And while the war had not yet reached its full intensity, its shadow stretched across the land in subtle ways. For those far from the cities, life continued to maintain a fragile sense of normalcy. Farmers worked their fields, children ran along paths between villages, and families gathered in the evenings. Even in the midst of change, the traditions and rhythms of daily life offered a comforting thread, a reminder that humanity persisted even in uncertain times. The soldiers themselves were learning to move quietly, to adapt to an environment unlike any they had known. Dense forests, heavy rainfall, and unfamiliar terrain made every step a cautious decision. Patrols moved slowly, with attention to detail and an awareness of the unpredictable nature of the surroundings. It was a world where silence often spoke louder than words, where patience could mean the difference between safety and danger. During this time, both the northern and southern regions of the country experienced the gradual escalation of conflict. Small towns and villages were touched by the war's presence, sometimes through the arrival of troops, sometimes through distant news of battles, and sometimes through the subtle impact of changing governance and local resistance. The story of the war was growing, not through loud announcements, but through these quiet, unfolding moments. From above, aircraft occasionally crossed the skies. Their engines were loud but brief, fading into the distance as quickly as they had appeared. Helicopters moved slowly over the landscape, carrying supplies or personnel, while the forests and rivers below remained largely untouched by their presence, except for the faint traces they left behind. The war was not yet defined by large-scale battles. It was defined by preparation, strategy, and the slow adjustment of people, soldiers, and landscapes. Each day contributed to the larger narrative, setting the stage for moments that would one day be remembered as significant turning points. Evening brought a calm hush over the countryside. The rivers mirrored the soft twilight, lanterns flickered in homes, and the forests whispered in the gentle wind. For a brief moment, the land seemed almost untouched by the tension above, holding within it the quiet resilience of generations who had lived, adapted, and endured. As you listen to this story, imagine the soft black and white images of 1960s Vietnam. Soldiers walking along muddy trails, helicopters hovering in the distance, dense jungles stretching endlessly, and villagers moving quietly in the fields. These images do not need to be specific. They capture the atmosphere, the mood, and the unfolding story, while your mind drifts gently along with the narration. And so, the early days of the war moved forward, not in dramatic bursts of action, but in subtle, patient progression. The threads of conflict were being woven slowly, quietly. Threads that would one day form a complex tapestry, stretching across years, landscapes, and countless lives. Even in these first months, lessons were learned, routines were established, and the people, the soldiers, and the land itself became intimately connected to the unfolding history. Each step, each movement, and each quiet decision carried weight, shaping the future in ways that would become clearer only as time passed. And so, the story continues, unfolding gently, patiently, a narrative of endurance, adaptation, and quiet tension, preparing the stage for the years to come. As you watch the footage, or imagine the black and white images of the era, let your mind move slowly. Drift along the rivers, the forests, and the villages. Feel the gentle rhythm of history unfolding, and let the calm of the narration carry you softly into the next stage of the story. As the months passed, the quiet tension that had filled the villages and forests began to shift. The war was no longer only a local struggle. It was becoming a stage for faraway powers, for decisions made across oceans, and for soldiers arriving from lands they had never known. The early 1960s saw the arrival of more troops from distant countries. They moved slowly through the countryside, careful to adapt to the rivers, forests, and mountains that define the landscape. Their uniforms, their packs, and the soft hum of machinery introduced a new rhythm into the familiar sounds of villages and fields. In the skies, aircraft began to appear more frequently. Helicopters carried personnel and supplies, their rotors slicing softly through the humid air. Occasionally, fixed-wing planes crossed the horizon, leaving trails that faded into the light of the sun. These flights were methodical, precise, and deliberate, as if the air itself had become part of the strategy. Soldiers learned to move carefully, to observe every shadow, and to respect the land around them. Paths that had once been traveled only by farmers now carried quiet convoys, small patrols, and occasional encampments. The forests and rivers, though vast and dense, were no longer untouched. Every movement, every careful step, contributed to the slow unfolding of the larger story. For the people living nearby, the presence of these troops was a subtle but constant change. Villagers continued with their daily routines, tending fields, fishing in rivers, gathering in homes, but the awareness of soldiers and machinery was ever present. Children would glance toward the distant sounds of engines, and families would pause, listening to the soft hum that carried through the trees. Life went on, yet life was now intertwined with the war. The strategies of this early stage were slow, deliberate, and methodical. Supply routes were established, small bases created, and patrols moved like quiet threads weaving through the dense tapestry of the land. Even in moments that seemed ordinary, the weight of history was quietly pressing upon everyone involved. Night brought a special kind of calm. Lanterns glowed softly in village homes. Rivers reflected the pale light of the moon. Helicopters rested on distant fields, and the forest exhaled with a gentle whisper in the wind. For a moment, the land seemed untouched, yet the presence of the war lingered quietly in the shadows. The early air campaigns were not loud spectacles. They were calculated movements, careful flights, and measured strikes that often occurred far from the eyes of civilians. Helicopters glided over the forests, moving supplies or personnel, while distant planes traced paths across the sky, each flight leaving a gentle but lasting impression on the rhythm of life below. Soldiers learned the language of the terrain. The jungles taught patience. The rivers taught observation. The mountains demanded respect. Every day, every step, every patrol became part of the larger story. A story not told through dramatic battles alone, but through preparation, endurance, and the quiet persistence of those living in and around the conflict. The people of Vietnam experienced the war differently. Life continued with its small joys, markets, festivals, children playing near rivers, but these were now layered with the knowledge of conflict. Distant helicopters, fleeting patrols, and the occasional hum of engines reminded everyone that the world they had once known was changing. Even the forests and fields, which had been timeless, now carried traces of the growing struggle. As the presence of foreign troops increased, the land adapted around them. Temporary camps were built along trails, and supply lines stretched like quiet veins across the countryside. Soldiers moved carefully, often unseen, blending into the landscape. The daily rhythm of the villages now included these new elements. Distant movements, occasional convoys, and the subtle watchfulness of those who observed without interference. This period was not marked by dramatic confrontations, but by the slow escalation of presence, influence, and preparation. Each day added weight to the unfolding story. Every helicopter flight, every patrol, every camp, and every quiet adjustment contributed to the invisible architecture of a larger conflict yet to fully emerge. In the evenings, the land seemed almost untouched. Rivers reflected the soft light of twilight. Lanterns glowed gently in village homes. The forests whispered in the wind, and the mountains stood silently in the distance. Yet beneath this calm, the threads of strategy, preparation, and tension were woven ever tighter, stretching across the land and into the future. Even the soldiers, far from home and often young, adapted to this rhythm. They learned the subtle language of the terrain, the quiet signs of movement, and the patience required in a land that demanded observation more than force. Every step, every pause, and every decision became part of the narrative, a slow, patient story of endurance and adaptation. As you watch or imagine the black and white images of this era, helicopters hovering over rivers, soldiers walking through dense jungles, villages with lantern-lit homes, and fields stretching under the soft sun, let your mind move slowly along with the narration. Observe the atmosphere, feel the subtle tension, and sense the calm persistence that carried both the people and the soldiers through these early days. The early escalation of the Vietnam War was not defined by sudden, dramatic battles. It was defined by presence, preparation, and endurance. The quiet moments, the long walks through forests, the hum of helicopters, and the reflection of moonlight on rivers. All these formed the foundation of a conflict that would soon grow larger, more complex, and deeply felt by everyone in its path. And so, the story continues. Slowly, patiently, softly. Through rivers, forests, and villages. Through the lives of those who lived it, and those who quietly observed. Setting the stage for the years to come, for the unfolding of events that would eventually shape an entire nation. As the war progressed, the rhythm of life in Vietnam began to change more noticeably. The forests and rivers that had once seemed quiet and timeless now carried the subtle echoes of a growing conflict. Paths and trails that villagers had walked for generations were now part of a complex network of movement, used by soldiers from both near and far. The soldiers, often young and far from home, learned to adapt to the unique environment. The dense jungles required patience and careful observation. The rivers, twisting and deep, became both barriers and lifelines, guiding movements and offering quiet moments of reflection. Every step they took was measured, every pause deliberate, and every patrol slowly shaped the unfolding story of the war. Villages continued to function, though under a quiet awareness of the ongoing struggle. Farmers worked the fields, tending rice paddies that shimmered under the sun. Children ran along dirt paths, their laughter mingling with distant, gentle sounds of helicopters or vehicles. Families gathered in homes lit by lanterns, sharing meals and stories, while the subtle presence of soldiers in the distance reminded them that life was no longer entirely the same. The mid-war period was defined by small engagements, strategic movements, and persistent tension. There were no grand, continuous battles in every area, but rather a series of calculated operations, patrols, and brief encounters that slowly defined the conflict. Every movement through the forests, mountains, and rivers carried weight, both for the soldiers and for the people who observed from the villages and fields. Helicopters continued to move across the skies, sometimes carrying supplies, sometimes transporting troops, their presence constant but never overwhelming. Aircraft occasionally crossed the horizon, tracing soft lines against the sky. The land itself seemed to adjust to the rhythm of this movement, the forests and rivers absorbing each change, each passage, as though the country itself were quietly learning the patterns of the war. Soldiers formed routines amidst the uncertainty. They learned to sleep lightly, to move silently, and to observe every subtle sign of movement in the environment. The jungle, with its thick foliage and hidden trails, demanded respect. Every day became a lesson in patience, endurance, and the quiet persistence of living within a conflict that could appear without warning. The people living near these movements adapted as well. Markets remained open, children played near rivers, and families continued their daily activities. Yet, they also grew aware of the quiet tension, of patrols moving along distant trails, of the soft hum of engines in the skies above, and the occasional distant sounds that reminded them that the world outside their villages was present, watching, and influencing their lives. Through these years, small victories and setbacks were measured not by headlines, but by the slow changes in daily life. Paths cleared, villages observed, supplies delivered, and patrols completed. Each moment was part of the larger story, weaving together the experiences of soldiers, civilians, and the land itself. Evenings brought a gentle calm. Lanterns glowed softly in the villages, rivers reflected the pale light of the moon, and the forests whispered in the wind. The soldiers rested in temporary camps, and the villagers found quiet moments to eat, talk, or sleep. The land seemed timeless, yet beneath the surface, the war had left its subtle mark, slowly shaping both people and environment. During this time, the war began to touch more lives. Families saw young men leaving for patrols, returning tired but alive, and sometimes not returning at all. The rhythm of daily life carried grief and hope side by side, as communities continued to move forward, quietly resilient in the face of uncertainty. The forest trails, rivers, and hills became silent teachers. They taught patience to soldiers and endurance to villagers. The presence of helicopters and distant aircraft became part of the background music of life, a constant reminder of change, strategy, and the ongoing flow of events. As the mid-war period unfolded, small stories of courage and quiet determination became common. Soldiers helped each other across difficult terrain, shared food and water, and watched over one another in a land that demanded vigilance. Villagers continued their traditions, passed stories to their children, and found moments of joy despite the shadow of conflict. The war was never just about battles or strategy. It was about adaptation, observation, and persistence. It was about learning to live amidst uncertainty, to find calm amidst tension, and to continue with life even as history slowly unfolded around you. As you watch or imagine black and white images of the era, see soldiers moving through jungles, helicopters hovering in soft sunlight, rivers winding through quiet villages, and children playing near paths once used only by farmers. These scenes do not need to be specific. They capture the atmosphere, the emotion, and the progression of the conflict, gently guiding your mind through the story. And so, the war continued, slowly escalating, patiently unfolding, through rivers, forests, and villages, through the quiet courage of those who lived it, and the subtle presence of history moving gently across the land. In these quiet moments, both soldiers and civilians learned resilience, patience, and the soft strength that comes from enduring uncertainty. The threads of conflict were weaving together, setting the stage for even larger changes and challenges yet to come. And as the nights passed and the mornings returned, the story of Vietnam moved steadily forward, slowly, softly, carrying with it both the weight of the past and the anticipation of the years ahead. As the years progressed, the presence of foreign soldiers in Vietnam grew steadily. The quiet forests, rivers, and villages now bore witness to a broader stage, where decisions made far away slowly reached the land and people below. Troops moved through the countryside in increasing numbers. Paths once trodden only by villagers and farmers were now part of complex networks used to transport personnel, supplies, and equipment. Every trail, riverbank, and clearing became part of the rhythm of war, carrying both activity and the quiet weight of anticipation. Helicopters filled the skies with their steady hum, carrying men, supplies, and sometimes equipment to locations near rivers, villages, and forests. Their movements were deliberate, creating a pattern that stretched across the land, a rhythm that became familiar to those who lived beneath their flight paths. Fixed-wing planes occasionally traced soft lines across the sky, leaving fleeting trails that faded into sunlight, almost like whispers of the war's growing presence. Soldiers learned to navigate the forests, hills, and rivers with careful observation. Every step mattered. Every pause was a decision. The dense jungle demanded patience, and the rivers required attention to detail. Soldiers moved slowly, deliberately, adapting to a land that was beautiful yet challenging, timeless yet marked by the presence of conflict. Villagers, meanwhile, adapted in their own ways. Daily life continued amid the subtle but constant changes. Farmers tended rice paddies under the early morning light. Children ran along the paths between homes, their laughter blending with the hum of distant helicopters. Families gathered for meals by lantern light, quietly adjusting to the presence of soldiers and equipment nearby. The early days of full-scale escalation were not defined by constant battles, but by preparation, movement, and positioning. Troops set up temporary camps, supply routes were carefully mapped, and patrols moved through jungles and villages with quiet determination. Even small decisions, like the placement of tents or the timing of patrols, carried weight, influencing the unfolding of events in ways that would only become clear later. As helicopters landed and departed, soldiers moved across fields and through forests with a sense of patience and vigilance. The rivers reflected the soft sunlight, and the shadows of trees stretched across muddy trails. Every step, every careful advance, became part of a larger story, a story shaped not just by battles, but by endurance, observation, and adaptation. Life for the people of Vietnam remained layered. Villages continued traditions that had existed for generations, preparing meals, weaving, fishing, tending animals, and sharing stories. Yet the quiet presence of soldiers and machinery reminded them that their world was changing, that the land they had known for decades was now intertwined with distant decisions and global politics. At night, the countryside regained a fragile calm. Lanterns glowed in village homes. The forests whispered in the wind. Rivers reflected the soft light of the moon. Even the soldiers rested, quietly observing, learning, and adapting to the land that held both beauty and challenge. The escalation also brought subtle shifts in perspective. Young soldiers far from home began to understand the rhythm of the land. The forests taught patience, the rivers taught caution, and the villages taught observation. Even amidst uncertainty, they found moments of connection, shared food, quiet conversations, and the steady movement through the terrain that demanded endurance and resilience. Air campaigns continued in a measured way. Helicopters carried supplies, transported personnel, and occasionally moved equipment to locations far from the villages. Fixed-wing planes traced soft arcs in the sky, creating a backdrop of constant, gentle movement. The land adapted to this rhythm, and the people adjusted alongside it, continuing to live while the quiet tension of conflict moved steadily forward. During this period, small moments of courage and quiet determination became common. Soldiers helped each other across difficult terrain. Villagers found ways to maintain daily life, even as patrols passed nearby. Children continued to play, sometimes unaware of the larger movements taking place, while adults carried both hope and caution in their hearts. The escalation was gradual but perceptible. Every helicopter flight, every patrol, every temporary camp, and every supply convoy added to the presence of a conflict that was slowly shaping the land, the people, and the soldiers. Even the forests and rivers, which had been timeless, now held traces of the growing struggle, subtle marks of human presence and strategic movement. As you watch or imagine black and white images of this era, picture soldiers walking through dense jungles, helicopters moving along river valleys, villages under soft lantern light, and rivers reflecting the quiet sun. See tents set up along trails, supply convoys moving slowly, and soldiers learning the rhythm of the land. These images do not need to be specific. They capture the atmosphere, emotion, and scale of this stage of the conflict, gently guiding your mind through the story. The full-scale escalation was a period of endurance, adaptation, and quiet strategy. It was defined by presence, movement, and preparation. It was defined by the patient learning of soldiers, the steady resilience of villagers, and the slow, deliberate rhythm of a conflict that would continue to shape the land and its people. Even as the days passed, the story moved forward gently. Through rivers, forests, and villages, through the quiet determination of soldiers, and the persistent resilience of civilians. History unfolded slowly, patiently, softly, carrying with it both the weight of the past and the anticipation of events yet to come. As the war continued, the land of Vietnam became a place of constant adaptation. Rivers, forests, and villages remained timeless in appearance, yet each day carried subtle traces of the ongoing struggle. Paths that had once only guided villagers now bore footprints of soldiers and travelers moving cautiously through the terrain. The soldiers, moving in small groups, learned to live quietly within the environment. They carried supplies and equipment with care, rested lightly, and moved slowly through forests and along riverbanks. Each day required patience and observation, a gentle awareness of every rustle, every shadow, and every movement in the foliage around them. Villages continued their rhythms, blending resilience with caution. Farmers tended the rice paddies, working steadily beneath the sun. Children played along dirt paths, sometimes pausing to watch distant patrols or the quiet movement of helicopters overhead. Families gathered in homes lit by lanterns, sharing meals, stories, and quiet laughter, even as the hum of machinery and distant skirmishes reminded them of the larger world beyond their fields. The war's conflicts were often small and intermittent at this stage. Quiet skirmishes occurred along jungle trails, rivers, or near strategic paths. They were measured, deliberate, and brief, leaving only subtle traces that spoke of movement and engagement. Even in these moments, the land itself absorbed the tension, remaining beautiful and timeless, yet subtly changed by the presence of human activity. Soldiers learned the ways of endurance. Long marches through muddy trails, careful observation of the canopy above, and attention to subtle signs of movement became part of daily life. Rivers became lifelines, offering both passage and reflection, while the dense forests required careful navigation and patience. Each day was a quiet lesson in adaptation, persistence, and mindfulness. For villagers, life carried both continuity and change. Markets remained open, children ran and played, and families maintained their routines. Yet the occasional arrival of a patrol, the distant hum of aircraft, or the soft glint of equipment in the sunlight reminded everyone that the world around them was not entirely still. Peace existed in small, fleeting moments, yet awareness of the ongoing conflict shaped every action and movement. Helicopters hovered over rivers and trails, sometimes for transportation, sometimes for observation. Fixed-wing planes traced soft arcs across the sky, leaving faint trails that vanished into sunlight. Even these distant movements became part of the landscape, part of the rhythm of daily life that blended human activity with the natural beauty of Vietnam. Soldiers and villagers alike learned to observe and adapt. The soldiers watched the forests for signs, the rivers for movement, and the skies for distant aircraft. Villagers continued to tend their farms, move along trails, and maintain routines, all while quietly adjusting to the presence of troops and the soft hum of machinery. Evenings brought a gentle calm over the land. Lanterns glowed in village homes, rivers reflected the soft moonlight, and the forests whispered in the wind. Temporary camps of soldiers rested quietly among the trees. Families gathered for meals, sharing moments of laughter, hope, and quiet conversation. The contrast between routine and tension became a subtle rhythm, a song of life under the watchful presence of the war. During these days, small acts of courage and endurance became common. Soldiers supported one another through long marches and challenging terrain. Villagers found ways to maintain normalcy, balancing daily life with the awareness of conflict nearby. Children, often unaware of the larger forces shaping their world, ran freely along trails, their laughter a soft echo of innocence within a land quietly touched by war. The forests, rivers, and mountains themselves played silent roles. They demanded respect, patience, and careful observation. Every step taken through the jungle, every pause by the river, and every movement along a trail became part of the ongoing story. The land remained timeless in appearance, yet the human presence layered subtle changes upon it, gently weaving the narrative of endurance, adaptation, and quiet resilience. As you watch or imagine black and white images of this stage of the war, soldiers moving carefully through dense jungles, helicopters hovering softly over rivers, villagers tending rice paddies, children playing along paths, lanterns glowing at night. Let your mind move gently along with the narration. Notice the calm persistence, the quiet courage, and the enduring rhythm of life within a land touched by conflict. This period of the war was not marked by loud battles alone. It was marked by endurance, adaptation, and the careful observation of every detail. Soldiers and civilians learned to coexist with the environment, to adjust to change, and to persist even amidst uncertainty. The threads of conflict were gradually weaving together, connecting rivers, forests, trails, villages, and lives in ways both subtle and profound. And so, life under conflict continued, quietly, softly, patiently, through rivers, jungles, and villages, through the small victories, careful movements, and gentle endurance of both soldiers and civilians. The story of Vietnam unfolded slowly, a quiet yet powerful testament to resilience, adaptation, and the soft persistence of life amidst uncertainty. As the war moved deeper into its years, the land of Vietnam bore witness to new rhythms. The forests, rivers, and hills remained timeless, yet their quiet beauty was now punctuated by the steady presence of soldiers, camps, and machinery. Temporary base camps appeared in small clearings and along the edges of villages. Tents and simple structures provided shelter for young soldiers far from home. Inside these camps, routines were established, meals shared quietly among comrades, maps spread across wooden tables, and soft conversations under the canopy of trees. Even amidst the uncertainty, moments of camaraderie and gentle human connection were found in these spaces. The soft hum of helicopters became a constant presence in the skies. Some carried supplies to distant outposts, others transported soldiers across rivers and jungles. Their movements were methodical, almost graceful, slicing through the humid air with steady rhythm. Villagers and soldiers alike adapted to this constant motion, finding a quiet acceptance in the sound that had become part of everyday life. Daily life in the camps was a balance of preparation, patience, and quiet adaptation. Soldiers learned to rest lightly, move carefully through the forests, and remain aware of the subtle signs around them. Every task, from cleaning gear to preparing meals, was performed with a gentle rhythm, as though the war demanded not only strength but mindfulness and endurance. Outside the camps, villages continued their routines under the soft light of the sun. Farmers worked the fields, children played along dirt paths, and families maintained traditions that had endured for generations. Yet all activities were gently touched by the presence of the war. The soft hum of distant helicopters, the occasional movement of troops along jungle trails, and the quiet preparation of base camps reminded everyone that life and conflict now moved side by side. The forests and rivers continued to play a silent role in the daily story of the war. They offered passage, concealment, and reflection. Rivers mirrored the sunlight, forests whispered with the wind, and mountains stood silently in the distance, observing the unfolding rhythm of life, both human and natural. Patrols became a regular part of life, moving slowly and carefully through the terrain. Soldiers learned to read subtle signs, the way leaves moved in the wind, the ripple of a river, or the soft tracks along a muddy trail. Every step required attention, patience, and respect for the land. Even in moments of waiting or quiet observation, the environment spoke volumes, guiding and teaching those who traveled through it. Villagers, in turn, observed the patterns of movement with quiet awareness. Markets continued, festivals were celebrated, and children ran along familiar paths. Yet they learned to adapt to the presence of soldiers, helicopters, and temporary camps. Life carried both continuity and change, and resilience quietly grew among those who lived under the soft shadow of the conflict. Helicopters and aircraft occasionally brought glimpses of the wider world. Their arrivals and departures created moments of motion and transition, marking the passage of time and the unfolding of events. The soldiers adapted to this mobility, using the skies to move supplies and personnel efficiently, while the villagers watched with curiosity and awareness. Evenings in the base camps brought a gentle sense of calm. Lanterns flickered softly, casting long shadows across tents and paths. Soldiers rested, shared stories, and reflected quietly on the day. Outside, rivers glimmered under the moon, forests whispered in the gentle wind, and villages glowed with the warm light of homes and lanterns. In these moments, life seemed fragile yet enduring, a delicate balance of human presence and natural rhythm. During this period, the war was defined by quiet endurance and the gentle persistence of daily life. Small victories and careful movements shaped the narrative as much as any large-scale engagement. Soldiers learned patience, observation, and teamwork, while villagers adapted, observed, and carried on, blending tradition with the new reality around them. The forests, rivers, and mountains themselves became teachers. They demanded patience, resilience, and respect. Every step through a jungle trail, every pause by a river, and every careful movement along a path contributed to the subtle weaving of the story. The land was timeless, yet now layered with the presence of humanity and the quiet tension of a world in change. As you watch or imagine black and white images of this stage, helicopters moving along rivers, soldiers walking through dense jungles, tents in base camps, villagers tending fields, and children playing near paths. Let your mind absorb the calm persistence. Notice the gentle rhythm of life, the soft endurance of soldiers and civilians, and the quiet, subtle presence of history unfolding around them. This period was a slow, deliberate unfolding of events. It was a time of adaptation, endurance, and quiet observation. Through the daily movements of soldiers, the persistent routines of villagers, and the constant rhythm of the environment, the story of Vietnam continued softly, patiently, and gently. And so, life under the mid-war escalation continued. Through base camps, helicopters, forests, rivers, and villages. Through quiet resilience, soft endurance, and gentle adaptation. History unfolded in whispers and soft movements, patiently preparing the land and its people for the chapters still to come. As the war in Vietnam stretched into years, its reach expanded far beyond the rivers, forests, and villages. The quiet, enduring rhythms of daily life in Vietnam were now connected to a world that was watching, reacting, and questioning. Across oceans and continents, people began to voice their concern. In distant cities, young men and women gathered quietly, holding signs, singing songs, and organizing peaceful protests. Universities, streets, and public squares became spaces for reflection and resistance. The messages were gentle but persistent, asking questions about the presence of soldiers, the costs of conflict, and the lives affected far away. In the United States, decisions made in offices far from the forests of Vietnam slowly shaped the rhythm of the war. Leaders weighed reports, debated strategies, and considered the consequences of every movement, every troop deployment, every helicopter flight over distant rivers. Maps, charts, and gentle hums of typewriters created the background of decisions that would ripple thousands of miles away, touching soldiers, villages, and rivers in Vietnam. International voices grew louder, though still peaceful. Protests in Europe, Asia, and the Americas quietly urged reconsideration of actions and policy. The world watched the unfolding story with concern and empathy, wondering how decisions made far away affected those living daily with the presence of conflict. These movements became part of the larger narrative, threads of conscience woven into the tapestry of a war that was no longer confined to a single land. In classrooms, cafes, and city streets, people discussed the reports, photographs, and stories that reached them through newspapers and television. They questioned the costs, the reasoning, and the morality of decisions that had become global in consequence. Songs, poetry, and quiet demonstrations became gentle acts of resistance, soft reminders that the world was connected even when separated by oceans. Back in Vietnam, soldiers and villagers continued their routines, often unaware of the discussions happening in faraway cities. Yet, the presence of the world outside was slowly felt through changes in policy, troop movements, and the gradual awareness that the war was no longer hidden from global attention. American leadership faced difficult choices. Decisions were made about troop deployments, supply strategies, and engagement rules. Even as the machinery of war moved steadily across rivers, forests, and mountains, these choices reflected both caution and urgency. Each decision carried consequences, echoing through the lives of soldiers in the jungles and the quiet villages they passed. International reactions also influenced media, culture, and opinion at home. News reports, black and white photographs, and stories of distant places reached living rooms and gathering spaces. People reflected quietly, sometimes with sadness, sometimes with hope, that their voices, their questions, and their protests could gently influence the larger rhythm of events. Amid this global attention, soldiers in Vietnam continued their daily tasks. They patrolled forests, crossed rivers, set up temporary camps, and observed the land carefully. Villagers adapted alongside them, carrying on traditions while quietly accommodating the subtle presence of the war. Even as global protests and political decisions shaped the broader story, the local rhythm of life persisted, resilient and enduring. The war's reach into the international arena also shaped cultural perspectives. Artists, writers, and filmmakers began to explore the stories of soldiers and villagers, of decisions made far away and lives lived in consequence. These narratives traveled gently across borders, reminding the world of the human threads that connected distant lands and people. Evenings in Vietnam remained moments of quiet reflection. Lanterns glowed softly in village homes, rivers reflected the soft moonlight, and forests whispered in the gentle wind. Soldiers rested in temporary camps, perhaps reflecting on letters from home, while villagers shared meals and stories. The connection to the wider world was subtle but real, like a gentle hum beneath the softer rhythms of daily life. Protests, debates, and political decisions became part of the evolving story. They were not loud battles, but acts of patience, observation, and quiet influence. People across the globe learned to ask questions, to reflect, and to seek understanding, creating a silent yet persistent layer of history alongside the physical movements of soldiers and villagers. Even as political discussions continued thousands of miles away, life in Vietnam persisted in its soft rhythm. Rivers flowed steadily, forests whispered with the wind, and mountains remained quietly eternal. Soldiers moved with care, villagers worked their fields, and children played along familiar paths. The world outside had its voice, but the land, the people, and the soldiers each had their own quiet stories to tell. As you imagine or display images from this period, black and white photographs of peaceful protests abroad, soldiers in camps, villagers continuing daily life, helicopters in the distance. Allow your mind to absorb the dual rhythm of conflict and conscience. Notice the soft connection between faraway decisions and local endurance, between global concern and the quiet persistence of life on the ground. This stage of the Vietnam War was defined by connection, reflection, and endurance. Decisions and protests, distant and near, shaped the narrative alongside the daily rhythms of soldiers and civilians. The story unfolded not only in forests, rivers, and villages, but across continents, oceans, and mines, gently reminding all that history is made of intertwined threads, seen and unseen, quiet yet profound. And so, the story moved forward. Through global voices, political decisions, rivers, forests, and villages. Through quiet endurance, reflection, and persistent observation. History unfolded softly, patiently, and with quiet emotional weight, preparing for the final chapters yet to come. The war for decades moved slowly, through dense forests, along winding rivers, and over quiet village paths. Yet now, a decisive moment was approaching. In early 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a final major campaign, an offensive that would soon reshape the future of the country. As the spring months unfolded, the air carried a strange mixture of tension and inevitability. The quiet of rural trails and village lanes contrasted sharply with the distant thunder of artillery and the steady movement of large military formations. The final push was not chaotic. For many, it was swift, resolute, and unrelenting, a precise march toward destiny. In one of the last major battles, the town of Xuan Loc became a focal point. South Vietnamese forces made a determined stand, fully aware that they were defending more than just land. They were defending the capital itself. Yet, despite their courage, the northern forces pressed forward. The fall of Xuan Loc opened the way, a gateway to the heart of Saigon. Across the city, tension mounted. People watched as columns of soldiers advanced, tanks rolled closer, and the southern government began to falter. In homes and streets, a quiet panic settled over families. Belongings were hastily packed. Futures were uncertain. The air was thick with fear, anticipation, and resignation. By April, the final phase began. Saigon was encircled, its streets teeming with both anxiety and chaos. Leaders resigned. Resistance faltered. Thousands gathered near the US Embassy, hoping for rescue, clinging to any thread of hope. Helicopters lifted people from rooftops, ferrying them to ships waiting offshore. For many, those last hours were a mixture of fear, hope, and heartbreak, a desperate scramble to escape the inevitable. On April 30th, 1975, the decisive moment arrived. North Vietnamese tanks broke through the gates of the presidential palace. The government surrendered, and decades of war culminated in a dramatic, irreversible turn. That day marked not only a military victory, but also a profound historical milestone. Reunification Day would later be celebrated by the new nation. In the aftermath, the city, now under new control, became a symbol of both triumph and loss. Relief existed alongside grief for those left behind. Some fled, carrying memories and possessions. Others stayed, uncertain of what lay ahead. Thousands of South Vietnamese suddenly found themselves entering a world reshaped beyond recognition. Their government dissolved, their daily lives forever changed. International eyes remained fixed on Vietnam. Decisions made far away had helped bring this moment about, and now the world watched as a new chapter unfolded. In the United States, debates raged over what had been lost, the lessons to be learned, and the human cost of 2 decades of conflict. Across the globe, people reflected on the toll of war and the struggles yet to come. Within Vietnam, the transition began. Provisional governments gave way to new structures, and plans for reunification were set in motion. On July 2, 1976, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam was officially declared. A new era dawned, though not without shadows and challenges. But the end of fighting did not signal the end of struggle. Families who remained behind wondered how their lives would change. Refugees who survived desperate evacuations carried deep scars of loss and longing. A land torn by decades of conflict now faced the monumental task of healing, rebuilding, and reconciling. Even as stability slowly returned, the wounds of war were still fresh. Economies were fragile, infrastructure damaged, and trust broken. Political decisions, made over years, now shaped reconstruction plans and the complex work of uniting a divided nation. Questions lingered in the hearts of many. What would become of those who had fought on different sides? How could the new nation balance memory with reconciliation? Could a country recover from decades of war, not only physically but emotionally? As night fell over Saigon, soon to be called Ho Chi Minh City, lanterns glowed softly in its streets. People reflected on what had been lost and what might come. Rivers, forests, and mountains outside the city remained silent witnesses, holding centuries of history while now carrying new stories. Stories of reunification, of memory, of grief, and of hope. This moment of change was not the end, but a beginning, a fragile turning point leading into years of rebuilding, reconciliation, and transformation. Though the war had reached its climax, the deeper story, of a land healing, a people rebuilding, and a nation forging its future, was only just beginning. The war had ended, but for many, the journey was only beginning. Vietnam's rivers, forests, and villages remained as they had always been, yet the lives of its people were changing in ways both profound and lasting. After reunification, the new government established so-called re-education camps. Thousands of former soldiers, government officials, intellectuals, and civilians were taken to remote locations. These were not merely detention centers, but places where people were expected to be re-educated. In the camps, detainees often had to confess past crimes, learn new political ideologies, and perform labor under strict supervision. Life was harsh. Days were long and exhausting, filled with difficult physical work like clearing land, building infrastructure, or other demanding tasks. Some people remained for years, even when earlier promises suggested they might be released sooner. Upon leaving, many found themselves under continued watch, living with restricted freedom and uncertainty. At the same time, a mass exodus began. Many Vietnamese felt their futures were uncertain. Homes, livelihoods, and social positions had been lost. Brave men, women, and children took to the sea in fragile boats, becoming the world's boat people. Between 1975 and the following decades, millions risked everything for a chance at safety. Their journeys were perilous. Overcrowded vessels, scarce food and water, storms, and the constant threat of pirates. One story reflects this struggle vividly. Families leaving Saigon on rickety boats, braving weeks at sea, uncertain whether they would ever reach safety. Some eventually found temporary refuge in camps across Southeast Asia, places of waiting, loss, and hope. In 1975, Operation New Life evacuated many to Guam, where they stayed in tent cities before being resettled. Later, under Operation New Arrivals, thousands were flown to the United States, embarking on a new life in a foreign land. Meanwhile, back in Vietnam, the New Economic Zones program reshaped daily life. Many southern residents, especially those associated with the old regime or deemed unreliable, were relocated to remote, undeveloped areas. Conditions were harsh. Basic infrastructure was minimal, Work was hard, and survival itself was a daily challenge. Ethnic Chinese Vietnamese faced particular difficulties. Businesses were seized, families were forced to relocate, and many chose the dangerous path of escape by sea, joining the wave of refugees. Amid these sweeping changes, countless personal stories emerged. One family's tale begins in Saigon. The father was sent to a re-education camp for years, while the mother and children escaped by boat, eventually landing in a refugee camp in Southeast Asia before being resettled in the United States. They rebuilt their lives in a new land, carrying the memories of Vietnam softly in their hearts. The trauma of separation, exile, and re-education was deeply personal as well as political. Those who stayed behind often lived with fear, guilt, or longing, while those who left carried grief for family and life lost. Freedom came at the price of distance from home and identity, a bittersweet inheritance that shaped the next generation. In the new socialist Vietnam, everyday life transformed. Communal farms, collective labor, and state-managed structures altered the rhythms of daily existence. Old social structures, class distinctions, and economic systems were replaced by new political ideals. Yet hope persisted. Over time, some former detainees reunited with families. Refugees abroad built new communities, forming little Saigons in foreign countries, preserving traditions and memories while raising new generations. The land itself, rivers, forests, and mountains, seemed unchanged, yet the people's lives had shifted profoundly. Memories of war, loss, escape, and survival blended into daily routines. Though the fighting had ended, many carried invisible battles, struggles with reconciliation, identity, and the meaning of home. As you imagine these scenes, black and white images of camp life, overcrowded boats at sea, refugee shelters in foreign lands, rural resettlement zones, families in exile, the quiet, emotional weight of this period becomes tangible. Every face, every step, every memory tells a story of resilience, fragility, hope, and the enduring human spirit. Life had changed, yet the journey toward rebuilding, healing, and belonging was only beginning. The decades after the war were not simply a quiet ending. They became a time of renewal, transformation, and the slow weaving of a new identity for Vietnam. In 1986, a historic turning point arrived. The Communist Party held its 6th National Congress, and with it came a bold change, Doi Moi, or renovation. It was more than just a policy shift. It was a new direction for the nation, moving from a rigid, centrally planned economy to a socialist-oriented market economy, a path that would gradually open Vietnam to the world while striving to preserve its spirit. In the years that followed, life began to change in subtle, yet profound ways. Farmers suddenly felt a new sense of freedom. Land was allocated more fairly, incentives encouraged innovation, and private enterprise slowly began to take root once again. In the cities, industries expanded and foreign investment, once unthinkable, started to flow in. One of the key figures guiding this new era was Nguyen Van Linh. Under his leadership, Vietnam pursued a delicate balance, maintaining socialist ideals, yet allowing market dynamics, private businesses, and greater openness. The results were remarkable. Over the following years, the economy steadily grew, poverty fell, exports increased, trade routes reopened, and opportunities emerged for ordinary citizens. A land once defined by rigid central planning was beginning to foster innovation, entrepreneurship, and a new energy. At the same time, the process of reconciliation continued. The wounds of war, etched into villages, families, and communities, did not simply vanish. But over time, a new generation emerged, one that carried memories of hardship, yet also embraced hope for unity. Former soldiers, once divided by ideology, walked the same streets again. Exiles gradually returned. Some remembrances were painful, others quietly healing. The land itself, rivers, forests, and mountains, seemed to change along with its people. Cities grew, villages modernized, and lantern-lit homes began to share space with electric lights, motorbikes, and new infrastructure. Markets opened wider. New businesses flourished. Foreign visitors arrived. Vietnam was no longer just a land of memories of war. It was becoming a land of possibilities. Yet, growth did not erase the past. There remained a deep need to balance memory with progress, to acknowledge what had happened, honor those who were lost, and build a future that could hold all stories. Parts of society debated how to remember the war, while others focused on rebuilding and looking ahead. Internationally, Vietnam deepened ties with former adversaries, expanding trade, fostering cultural exchanges, and learning to transform scars into part of the nation's identity rather than only a burden. In villages, people shared stories of past hardship, of war, displacement, and loss, but also of resurgence. Children attending school, families starting businesses, farmers harvesting rice with new methods, and communities slowly regaining hope. In cities, young entrepreneurs and workers carried dreams of peace and prosperity, understanding that transformation was not only economic, but also deeply personal and collective. Vietnam's journey during these years reminds us that healing is not a straight line. Reform, reconciliation, and growth did not erase the past, they reframed it. The country learned to carry its memories gently while building something new, a future shaped by resilience, creativity, and hope. As night falls over modern Vietnam, imagine soft scenes. Rivers glowing under city lights, lanterns mingling with neon, children playing near the hum of motorbikes, farmers tending fields in the early morning light, and communities gathering in towns and cities, quietly weaving the stories of their past into the fabric of their present. The story of Vietnam is far from over. It lives in the laughter of marketplaces, in the rhythm of bustling streets, in the quiet reflection at historical sites, and in the aspirations of new generations. Though the war is now part of history, its echoes continue, in the hearts of the people, in the pulse of a nation, and in the slow, beautiful weaving of memory and progress. As our story comes to a gentle pause, the threads of history continue to weave quietly, through forests, rivers, cities, and the hearts of people. Every tale we explore, every memory we uncover, carries with it the whispers of the past, softly guiding us through time. Here, on The Timeless Narrator, we journey together, through battles and peace, legends and real-life stories, across centuries and across lands. We slow down, we reflect, and we let the stories unfold, allowing their weight and beauty to settle quietly in our minds. If you've traveled with us through this chapter of history, let the journey continue. Subscribe to The Timeless Narrator to hear more stories, from long-forgotten events to timeless legends, each told in calm, soothing narration. A place where history becomes a story, and stories become a moment of reflection. Click the bell icon to stay connected, so every new tale can find its way to you, softly, patiently, and gently. And remember, history is not just dates and events. It's the lives, the emotions, and the quiet courage of those who came before us. Thank you for listening. Sit back, relax, and let the next story carry you into the whispers of time.